firms may be earlier on in their implementation efforts. And so we thought it would be timely. Many of you bring to the table experience in implementing both new auditing standards and new accounting standards. And so we're interested in all your input kind of on best practices and how to approach implementation, because we appreciate it's more than reading staff guidance. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ekaterina Desna.
Thank you, Barb, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to lead the discussion on this topic. So Barb has already talked about the recently completed projects and all the wonderful implementation resources that we've issued, so I'm not going to repeat what has already been said. I do want to spend a few minutes and talk about resources that we have available for smaller firms. And then we can have an open discussion about best practices for implementing new standards, especially for those that might work for smaller firms. So we recently launched on our website a dedicated page for auditors at smaller firms. It's essentially a one-stop shop for resources, tools, and information specifically designed for smaller firms in mind. As Barb and Chair Williams mentioned earlier, we hosted a QC workshop last week. It was geared towards smaller firms. We plan to have another one in June, and we also will be hosting 2 virtual workshops. Again, also geared towards smaller firms. We also continue to host nationwide forums on auditing in the small business environment to provide updates about PCAOB activities to registered firms that audit public companies considered to be small businesses. These forums are primarily designed to share information with registered firms that audit brokers, dealers, many of which are small audit firms. Small business forums provide an opportunity to learn about the work of the board and hear more about current issues impacting the auditing profession. And the most recent forum was held on May 1st in Jersey City. It was hosted by board member Borek. And lastly, we have an Audit Focus Publications, which is a series of short and easy-to-digest publications with information for auditors, especially those who audit smaller public companies, many of which are small audit firms. Each edition of Audit Focus reiterates the auditing standards and staff guidance, as well as offers reminders and good practices with an eye towards protecting investors and improving audit quality. There are actually 5 Audit Focus publications that we issued during 2024 and 2025. You see 4 listed on the slide, but yesterday we just issued one more called Auditing Accounting Estimates. So moving closer to the topic of discussion, so some of the best practices that we've identified through our ongoing outreach to firms about the implementation of QC 1000, we've heard that having a project plan. Then we also heard that identifying decision makers earlier in the process. So who are the people who will be making key decisions about implementing the standard? Conducting gap analysis. So we've heard the firms were comparing their QC system compliant at the other quality management standards, but what it would look like complied with QC 1000. So we're identifying the gaps and trying to fill in with gaps. Also, we heard about developing milestones and measuring progress against those milestones, establishing a committee to oversee progresses, and ensuring the project plan also considers rollout and necessary communications and training. So those are the things that were important. And with that, that brings me to the question for this group's discussion. Are there any other best practices that you would like to share, either based upon your own direct experience with implementing a new or amended auditing standard, or PCAOB standards, or any other relevant experience that you have in implementing an accounting or standard? Essentially, we're looking for any best practices, including those that could be scalable for smaller audit firms that you may suggest based on your experience. So with that, I'll open the floor for discussion.
Go ahead, Sandy Peters.
Yeah, my question is related to the small firms
analysis here, as well as the task force that was announced. And one of the things that I think that many need is an analysis of how small are the firms are we talking about, what meets the definition of a small firm, about how are they, about how many companies are we talking about, and about what market cap are we talking about. So we can right size what the issue is. It'd be useful to quantify and right size the size of this issue in the number of, in market cap, in the number of firms and the number of companies. And I'm just wondering if you guys, as a part of this task force, and if you create a page for the task force, could provide that information for us. I mean, I'm sure that I could figure it out, you know, with audit analytics and looking at Form AP, but like, I don't think a lot of people need to redo that, right? So part of it is, are we looking at how small are these organizations, right? And how small are the auditors, so that we can figure out how much we should devote time to it.
Thank you.
Great, and I'm going to move over to Christine Devine.
Thank you. As far as the best practices, those are consistent with what we do when we implement a new standard. Another item that we do is we do coordinate with our colleagues in the larger firms, so among the big four, and we reach out to the PCOB. So I want to say that's an important part of our best practices. And on that same theme, because we're talking about the smaller firms, one thing that I think could be helpful is that when the firms, particularly the larger ones, reach out, is that dialogue, that question finds its way into a formal interpretation, a Q&A type format that's issued by the PCOB, similar to what the SEC does with what's called compliance and disclosure interpretation. So that formal then Q&A will be more available to the smaller firms, which sometimes are not at the same table dialoguing with the larger firms. And then as far as what that interpretation would contain, I think it's important to be something incremental above the technical words that the standards say, so that it is something that's interpretive with practical examples that can be relied on.
Thank you, Christine, and I'll move over to Preeti Chowdhury.
So one thing I was thinking it might be worthwhile to add to the list is some sort of review or look back post-mortem to see if what was implemented met the actual standards as intended, or if there was some issues that came up in practice.
Thank you, Preeti. And Brian Croto?
Yep, thanks. And I agree with Christine that these practices could apply to firms of any size. I would say maybe a couple things that we try to think about as we're implementing your standards and those of other standard setters. You know, I think it's important to embrace kind of the principles and the reasons that the standard was put in place and the requirements, because one can think of it as a compliance exercise and sort of tick the box and say, well, I have to do this, I have to do that because the standard says so. Obviously, we want to comply, but we also want to maximize the value that we get and maximize the effect that we have in implementing. And so we think a lot about that as we're implementing standards. We spend a lot of time with your release text. Why did you think this was a problem? What problem are we trying to solve? Are there things we should do that are even incremental to what you've put in the standard, or different in some way while still complying with the requirement, obviously, in the standard? So we think a lot about that because we want the value to represent something meaningful in terms of the incremental costs that we're going to incur relative to implementing new standards. We also try to integrate into our kind of normal activities. So when I say that, whether that be in performance of individual audit procedures or something we're doing in our system of quality management, we try to avoid sort of these bolt-on, like this is just one more thing one has to do and you have to do it aside from, but integrate it into things that we otherwise are having teams do, or we do in our system of quality management, because when you do that, it's more likely to happen on a consistent basis, just like companies do when they think about their own system of controls from an ICFR perspective, for example. And then we try to make sure we've explained well to whether it be the practice or if it's our system of quality management, our responsible functional leaders and control owners, what it is we're asking them to do and why we're asking them to do it and what the expectations are of how they ought to do that. That goes to training and making sure you've got the right plan around that. To Christine's point on coordination among the professions, certainly that's very much focused on compliance, obviously. Just making sure that if we have questions about what the standard actually says or requires, that we have the ability then to, through the CAQ often, or sometimes on our own as firms, certainly engage with the PCOB, and we appreciate those opportunities. I'll come to one where we have been doing that, where we have an open question, maybe later in the discussion here, but at least at the moment on this slide, those are some things that I would offer in terms of maybe some practices that firms, I'm sure many firms think about, but I thought I would articulate.
Thank you, Brian. And James Fries?
First, I just wanted to emphasize what Preeti said, that in normal project management, we need to bring it to a close, and that is the lessons learned. And ultimately, what we're talking about here is any new standard, and standards are going to change over time. So it should be a repeat process, and we should spend more time on the substance and develop this type of project plan, again, of which lessons learned, feedback loop is important. But the other thing that I would emphasize that frankly gets too often lost, and my outside perspective is often lost, and accountants or people who get too deep into the weeds, is not to forget why we're doing this. Especially when you have something new, especially regardless of how much effort we put into consultation and being out as clear as we can, it's a matter of first impression. So there will be ambiguities and questions that coming up. So if the team does not ask the question why in any aspects of this, that's the biggest danger of your failure.
Thank you very much, James. And I'll move over to Stephen Rivera.
I guess my only thought, maybe from an audit perspective, is how do we kind of consider maybe outreach in a different way? So what I mean by that is we get a lot of questions how maybe auditors are looking at it differently on how the standard's being interpreted. So we have maybe one firm going, as you mentioned, deep, and maybe looking at it maybe a different way of approaching it. So is there a way to have an outreach, very similar when we look at accounting standards, to kind of think about an audit approach that's consistent across the board? And what I mean by that is so that if you're looking at that standard, the auditors are talking the same language, so that the way they're approaching it, so as a preparer, we always get questions like saying, well, my firm is doing it this way versus that way, and well, why is that? And again, it could be materiality, but it's also how they interpret the standard to ensure that there's the way because they feel there's more risk the way the standard's being thought of in their firm versus another. So how do you kind of level set that from an outreach standpoint so that that standard is consistent, so preparers look at it the same way when they're talking to the auditors, if that makes sense?
Thank you, Stephen. And I'll move over to Stephen Morrison.
So a lot of what has been said previously, we do as well, and what you see up there. What I would encourage for, and I don't speak for all SMER firms by any stretch of the imagination, and Sandy was referring to small firms in this project, I imagine you're referring to outside the Big Four plus GT and RSM, everybody else, or is it the non-annually inspected? We're kind of, so basically it's everybody else but those firms that I just mentioned. So that's a large swath of firm sizes, and there's a lot of firms that are out there. And we have a project plan as well that go through it, but I know that sounds a few bullet points on a Word document, but it actually is much more robust and considers multi-channels. And it's, even though we're not a Big Four firm, which we have a lot of the same considerations that go about there in terms of applying a standard. And what I would encourage for the PCOB to consider when you have presentations and publications that are geared towards smaller firms, and I attended at the University of Miami, the smaller firm meeting with Board Member Ho, is I would encourage, which I am sincerely appreciative of the PCOB bringing those back, and I think those are great to build on. I would say assume we have read the standard and assume we have read the staff focus documents and the other documents that are there. I realize there's a tight line to walking to want to make sure there's not conflicting messages and that the messages are clear. But what I think we and probably firms of various sizes would benefit from would be understanding the intent of the auditing standard, the interpretation that was out there, and realize that we're learning in the inspection process that we went about it a different way is not a great time for us or any firm to go ahead and learn these things. So having the communication, assuming we've read the adopting releases and everything that's out there, would be very beneficial. And I would also encourage the PCOB has put out a lot of great publications, and I appreciate it, but also consider taking a look at what AICPA and IAASB have also been putting out in terms of, for example, the AICPA put out a very, let's say, robust or involved specific practice aid regarding to SQMS. So there's a lot of materials that are out there, and AICPA and IAASB, it's a lot of the same drivers that are out there. There's a lot of good information that I think that kind of collaboration would be helpful. So that was it for me.
Thank you very much, Steve. And I'll move over to Brian Croto.
Sorry. Yep. So maybe just coming back, Stephen, to some of your questions around consistency and Stephen, some of your points. So I think there's a difference in some of the PCOB standards. If you think about a standard like critical audit matters, there was probably the highest level of interaction that I can think of relative to the interaction among auditors and with the PCOB, because it involved a reporting standard and disclosure, and it was important that there'd be as common an understanding as possible as to what the requirements meant. And that's a lot different than a audit performance standard. Notwithstanding how cordial we all are to one another, we also are competitors. And when you think about the implementation of performance standards, we do want to make sure that we have a consistent understanding of what the PCOB is requiring. And so that's the dialogue that we have. How we go about doing it, of course, that's competitive, and we don't discuss that among firms. And there are some things that one firm may do differently than another for lots of good reasons. And some of it may have to do with the technology that one uses. It might have to do with the methodology you already have in place and how it relates to that methodology. And so there will be natural differences. Again, there's a lot of good discussion to be had from a profession perspective to enhance quality, to focus on what really matters from a reliable financial reporting perspective. And so I think you see in forums like this, even in the AI space, the discussion that we had today, where I think we can go pretty far in having discussions about the way we interpret existing standards and things that we are doing within our firms that we're able and willing to disclose. And of course, we can disclose anything we want in a public session that we choose. But there are reasons why our methodologies do differ. And so there is a fine line, or an important line, I guess I should say, at some point, and you will see differences. But that doesn't mean as issuers or management in audit committees that there aren't good, reasonable questions to ask if you see one firm doing something differently. And over time, I know that we have those good discussions, and all of our firms probably are evolving things that we do based on discussions like that we have. So I just thought maybe some context around that. And then I was just going to mention, I didn't mention before, but piloting is another thing that we do as a firm when we're implementing, and that can include getting feedback from audit committees and management relative to things that we're doing relative to implementing a standard. I know many of our firm certainly did, and I know many firms did relative to a standard like the implementation of critical audit matter reporting I come back to, just given the significance of that to the company. But there are other standards around which we do that. We almost always do it with respect to standards that we're implementing with our teams, and then how far we go with that relative to getting feedback from management and audit committees can vary depending on the nature of the new requirement. But I think that's an important thing to do. And then the monitoring that one puts around it as a firm, and then reflecting back as to how you might improve upon your implementation, is something we spend a lot of time thinking about. So all of those things I think are important. And Barb, I just can't help this. I don't know, this isn't the right time maybe, but I'm going to do it anyway. There is one aspect, because as we think about the risks relative to applying standards consistently, The one that I worry about the most at the moment is an amendment that was made to the PCB's standard on evidence, and it came out of the technology-assisted procedures standard or new requirements and standard-setting project, and it relates to electronic information that companies provide that they receive from one or more sources from external parties. And the footnote to the standard talks about POs and cash receipts, could be bank statements, shipping docs, all those things. And there was significant concern that was raised in the comment letter process about that requirement because the wording of it changed significantly from the proposal to the final standard. That resulted in firms, including ours, the CAQ, I know many other firms sitting around the table, writing comment letters to the SEC. And the SEC order suggested that the PCB ought to provide implementation guidance to describe how a risk assessment could be applied to that, because you could see a very wide range of interpretation, understanding of the literal words to that requirement. And I do fear that that's an example where there some regulatory clarity would be very helpful. And I know that we've had a chance through the CAQ to interact with Barb and her team, but the sooner we could see guidance on that's reflective of those kinds of discussions, I think the better, because that's an example where you could see the problem that you're describing emerge relative to a wide range of what firms think, and then through the inspection process, unfortunately having feedback that then causes there to be confusion. So that particular paragraph has caused, the amount of time and attention that's getting has been enormous relative to well outsized compared to anything else relative to that standard setting project and most of the new requirements that the PCB establishes.
Thank you, Brian. And I believe, Stephen, you have a response to something Brian said. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and then Alan Skinner, Jeff Mahoney, and then we'll move on to the next session.
And Brian, I absolutely agree with your point, and it's particularly when it comes to how the firms look at things, and it definitely, absolutely agree with you. But I guess my lens was more from the professional standpoint. I'm talking about the small preparer. I'm talking about the profession as a whole. And the question is, when we get together, like an industry group together, we try to come up with pragmatic solutions that represent the industry. So what I'm trying to say, even for the audit profession, to lessen the load and to come up with a way to approach something that creates less load for the folks coming into the profession. And there's a better way to do that. And that was my lens. I don't want to give competitive initial away, but that's where my head was, is that come up with a better audit approach that simplifies, especially for the folks that are in the practice.
Just very quickly, so appreciate that. I appreciate that. And I think the place where we do that best as a profession and with the CAQ is in the comment process, in the standard setting process, where we spend an enormous amount of time, and the vetting that we do of ideas in that space really helps inform our own comment letters, and it helps inform a profession comment letter, and really is done with the spirit of what you just described. Yeah.
Thank you, and go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, just some kind of basic best practices, and this is more from I guess a smaller firm perspective, but starting early on implementation, identifying the right people, including specialists in some cases, or IT folks, whatever, reading the adopting releases pretty thoroughly, and reaching out to the PCOB to get clarification on things. We've benefited from that in a few cases. And then going through internal inspection or post-implementation review, looking for how the implementation has gone.
Thank you, Alan. And Jeff Mahoney?
Thank you. I just want to comment, Brian, on your comments about the process and the procedures you used. It sounds like it's very thoughtful and a very good process. And you talked about the intent of the standards, that you look at the principle, the intent, the underlying basis. I think you mentioned you looked at the comment letters as well. It sounds like an excellent process to me. One recommendation I would make, and you may very well already be doing this, I don't know, but if you aren't, I would just encourage you to think about, when you do that, you look at the comment letters from the main customers of your product, investors and think about what they wanted in that standard and what in that standard relates to what they asked for, and consider that when you implement the standards. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. That was very helpful. So let's turn our attention to the last session of the day, and it is a session on the importance of firm culture. So our DRI Spotlight defines culture as a shared set of attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterize an organization. Given our focus on QC 1000 with the effective date coming up, on one hand, we thought it would be interesting to get your perspectives. We think that people will think about culture as they think about how to improve QC systems. And like I said, even though it's not a one-for-one compliance type of issue, but it can certainly enhance or detract from compliance. And so we know you all have a broad set of experiences and are interested in your views on various topics, including how you change culture if it's something that needs to be changed. And we've streamlined our remarks a little bit. I know some of you may have planes to catch, so we'll do our best to get through this and get you out of here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Barb. So today we want to have a collaborative discussion on the importance of firm culture and the impact of firm culture on audit quality. So we're going to start our discussion by addressing the link between firm culture and PCAOB standards, and then briefly discuss initiatives by other global organizations before talking about our own culture initiative and having an open discussion on firm culture. So AS 1000, General Responsibilities of the Auditor in Conducting the Audit, establishes the general principles and responsibilities of the auditor when conducting an audit, including those items shown on the screen. These principles and related responsibilities provide a foundation for the proper performance of an audit engagement and can be affected by firm culture. So as a very quick refresher, QC 1000 includes 2 process components and 6 additional components. So to quickly dive into the governance and leadership component and the firm's risk assessment process component, we're going to highlight how these 2 components are directly linked to firm culture. An audit firm's QC system has a critical link to audit firm culture, as quality control lays the groundwork for everything that auditors do. So speaking very briefly on governance and leadership, the quality objectives under this component in QC 1000 require, for example, communicating and promoting the firm's commitment to quality, linking performance evaluations and compensation to quality, making strategic decisions and actions that are consistent with and support the firm's commitment to quality, and obtaining or developing and allocating or assigning resources in a manner that allows the effective design, implementation, and operation of the firm's QC system. So that's one component. So then quickly, in terms of the risk assessment process component, QC 1000 requires that the firm must identify and assess quality risks to achieving each quality objective. Some of the examples of quality risks are the characteristics and management style of leadership, including the specific examples shown on the screen, and the extent to which a culture of integrity and commitment to audit quality, including ethics and independence, is promoted within the firm and embraced by firm personnel across all levels, including the examples that are shown on the screen. So when appropriately designed and implemented, a firm's system of quality control should foster a firm culture that supports high-quality audits. This includes providing the audit firm with reasonable assurance of complying with applicable professional standards, including, for example, AS 1000. So I'm now going to hand it over to my colleague from the Division of Registration and Inspections, Kalila Imperatrice. Kalila is going to take you through the PCAOB's Culture Initiative. Before she does that, however, I do want to quickly highlight that some of Kalila's comments will reference terminology from the interim quality control standards that will be rescinded on December 15th, 2025. and not terminology from QC 1000. However, we still wanted to discuss the culture initiative as we believe it'll provide helpful background to continue the discussion on firm culture as part of today's meeting. So Kalila, I will go ahead and hand it over to you.
In September of 2003, the Division of Registration and Inspections launched an initiative focused on culture at audit firms, which we called the Culture Initiative. The objective of the Culture Initiative was to explore and understand the drivers of audit firm culture and to probe whether the audit firm's culture had an impact on the rising levels of audit deficiencies we observed in our inspections from 2020 to 2023. Inspection staff conducted interviews with more than 150 partners across all 6 global network firms. We considered audit culture in terms of behavior, decisions, and firm systems and structures. Through the interviews and ongoing inspections of firms' QC systems, we developed several key takeaways related to firm culture and audit quality. As previously mentioned in our brief overview of QC 1000, an audit firm's QC system has a critical link to audit firm culture, as QC lays the groundwork for everything auditors do. And the audit firm's QC system encompasses the audit firm's organizational structure, the policies adopted, and procedures established to provide the audit firm with reasonable assurance of complying with applicable professional standards. The initiative outlined the following 4 important QC topics, among others, that we believe influence audit firm culture. These would be governance and leadership, resources, engagement performance, and information and communication. Under governance and leadership, this QC topic addresses the environment that enables effective oversight and operation of the QC system and directs the audit firm culture, decision-making processes, organizational structure, and leadership. Tone at the top is often considered a proxy for firm culture, and it's embedded within this topic. In the QC topic resources, this addresses the audit firm's processes for obtaining, developing, using, maintaining, allocating, and assigning the audit firm's resources to enable the design, implementation, and operation of the firm's QC system and performance of its engagements. The audit firm's resources include people, financial, technological, intellectual resources, and resources from its networks and third-party providers. For engagement performance, this QC topic addresses the audit firm's processes related to performance of the audit firm's engagements by its personnel and others in accordance with applicable professional standards and legal requirements. To the extent appropriate and as required by applicable professional standards, audit firm processes for obtaining, generating, using information, and to enable the design, implementation, and operation of the QC system and the performance of its engagements, and for communicating information within the audit firm and external parties on a timely basis. The key takeaways identified by the Culture Initiative are that audit firm culture can impact audit quality for better or for worse. For example, the respondents said that constant turnover can have an effect on the consistency and ultimately audit quality. We also recognize that audit firms with the highest percentages of respondents that started their careers at their respective firms had the lowest deficiency rates in the last 3 years. Similarly, we observed that audit firms with cultures marked by more centralization of the audit firm structure and standardization of audit processes, tools, templates appear to have fewer deviations in the procedures nationally and fewer Part 1A findings. The respondents from our interviews also suggested that the pandemic and the remote hybrid work environment has impacted the audit firm's apprenticeship model for on-the-job training and its dissemination of culture and professional skepticism. In addition, based on our observations, we believe audit firms have room to improve when it comes to creating cultures of accountability. We observe, for example, that negative quality events such as internal and external inspections restatements, and independence violations at some audit firms are not sufficiently evaluated or attributed to specific firm personnel. Rather than accepting responsibility for negative audit quality events, respondents from all 6 firms pointed to the complexity of their audit clients as one of the reasons for the increase in audit findings. Some of the respondents had concerns about competency of certain firm personnel and the appropriateness of how engagements are staffed. Respondents also expressed concerns about the push for the use of shared service centers is removing foundational skills from their junior staff and experiences from personnel. This lack of experience in basic audit skills could lead to additional difficulties as these individuals progress in their careers. Some respondents indicated that audit firm leaders sent mixed messages to engagement partners and other firm personnel about incentives and penalties for positive and negative audit quality events. In the view of these respondents, audit firms needed to ensure that the factors that drive adjustments to compensation are aligned with the behaviors that promote audit quality and are clearly communicated to audit firm personnel. With that, I'll turn it over back to Danny for the rest of our discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Kalila. So this is the portion of the session where we want to dive into a discussion. In the spirit of time, we had factored in doing the discussion in 2 parts. I'm going to run through the prompts for both of those parts now so that we can open up the floor to any commentary that people may want to provide. So if you bear with me while I go through 2 slides, and then I'll open up the floor. So while audit quality may have been the top priority for audit leadership, a significant percentage of other respondents, so through surveys done through the Culture Initiative, thought priorities such as meeting financial goals and growth were more important to leadership of the audit practice. Respondents indicated that these varying views on the top priority for audit leadership may be the result of generational differences, for example, millennials versus Gen Z, stage of career, for example, associate versus partner, and tenure and experience. For example, a manager that started with the firm as an intern versus a manager that started as an experienced hire. As firms continue to focus on the implementation of QC 1000 and to improve culture, it seemed timely to have a discussion on this particular topic. So we'd like to focus, again, and I'll take you through this portion of the discussion and then the next one at the same time. We'd like to focus on how you would take into account these factors, so the ones you see on the screen, generational differences, stage of career, tenure, and experience, and one additional factor that I hadn't mentioned, global operations, including those in emerging markets, how you would take into consideration those 4 factors when considering developing a quality control system, fostering a strong firm culture. So as part of this, it might be helpful to reference the 4 QC topics included on the previous slide. So I will flip back, and these are in your materials as well. So it might be helpful to have a look at these: governance and leadership, resources, engagement performance, information and communication, and consider them alongside these considerations. So, for example, one question might be, how might you ensure that staff are aware of and believe in the importance of taking responsibility and accountability for engagement performance when considering both staff that started at the firm as an associate and experienced hires that may have joined the firm at a more senior level? Another question could be, how might you ensure that staff display an appropriate level of professional skepticism when considering both an audit team based in an established market and an audit team based in an emerging market that may have a business environment that can create opportunities to perpetrate fraud? So effectively pairing those QC topics with the considerations on the screen. So the second part of the discussion that we wanted to have has a quicker setup. So we wanted to consider or ask what other considerations to developing and maintaining a strong firm culture and system of quality control that you think exists. So in addition to the considerations previously highlighted, how do you measure and test the strength of firm culture? How do you change firm culture? And what further steps you believe the PCAOB should take related to firm culture? So I appreciate we've had some specific prompts, but in general, we open the floor to any commentary that you'd like to share related to these points or firm culture.
And just one point of clarification, I mean, we're not looking to set standards around firm culture, but really rather how do people drive this to really have better compliance, so.
And thank you for that clarification, Barb. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dane.
Thanks. As I look at the 4 pillars or the 4 components of culture, I may recommend consideration of one more, or maybe it's embedded in here, but I think it kind of deserves its own. It's incentives. You tell me how someone's paid, and I'll tell you what their incentives are. And so, something focused on incentives and also along short-term versus long-term incentives. So I think one way you can turn a culture is if people have, if a lot of their compensation is ultimately tied to longer-term track records. So if you do an audit, how's that audit do then for the next 5 or 8 years? Is there a fraud discovered for one of those companies? And then basically you would lose some of your compensation if you essentially develop a bad track record where companies go bad on your watch and you haven't brought things to their attention. But ultimately bringing in a way to bring a long-termism to the profession is really important, because especially we had conversations before about all these evolving new financial structures for how firms are funding themselves and so on and so forth. Those can create a need or create a shift towards more short-termism, and short-termism is very dangerous in this profession and many professions.
And I'll go ahead and hand it over to James Fries.
Thank you. Starting with your first slide there. So the overall topic of professional skepticism, to me, you can only have that from the auditor as a whole if you have it within the organization. And it gets back to your question here about the generational differences, stage of career, tenure, and experience, that people all up the chain can raise questions. And to me, that's within your governance and leadership framework, specifically paragraph 29 of the QC 1000, which references whistleblower systems, something of which they're big globally, both within government authorities, such as directly to the SEC or to this organization, as well as within companies. But I think in a way you've underscored or not done enough in terms of expectation, because to myself, having run whistleblower systems both in the government and in the private sector, and have done benchmarking globally, the whistleblower is a last resort when you have not been able to effectively bring up through the chain of command. So in effect, you don't have a culture that allows you to raise skepticism and the like. When we make it too easy that the only pathway is to go the whistleblower system, you've already had a broken culture. And I just encourage you to make sure that that gets out, especially when we talk about implementing that paragraph, but also to use your own sources of whistleblower to see where is some of the breakdown in the culture.
Thank you very much for those remarks. And Christine Devine?
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the PCOB for focusing on this area. It is incredibly critical to driving high audit quality, to have a strong culture. To me, it is what differentiates the firms and again drives the audit quality, all of which is the system of quality controls is the foundation. But just to be brief in the interest of time and looking at some of the questions, and you asked one about change. How do you change firm culture? That is complicated, and it's a long process. But the key to me is aligning it with your strategy. So it has to be incorporated, your culture, into every strategic decision you make. So we talked about firm transactions, investments by PEI. Quality and your culture has to drive that. Every client you accept, back to a strategic decision, is their culture consistent with our culture? Are their values consistent with our culture? And I think if you approach every decision that way, it can help to drive change. You also had a question about how do you measure and test the strength of your culture. We do a lot of surveys to do that. We do focus groups. It's in our performance management system. But you got to walk the halls too, and listen to folks and understand what every single level, from your interns, quite frankly, to your top leadership, thinks on that issue.
Thank you very much, Christine. And Jennifer Jo?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to give these comments. I think one of your questions talks about the generational differences, and I think the issue that is built into the problem is that partners make partners, and so the process in the firms is generally looking at qualities that were acceptable to a generation ago, that those are the people who are making decisions. And so when you talk to junior auditors, the concern, because I've done research projects where we look at the path to partnership, only certain types of behaviors are rewarded within the firms, generally client building behaviors. For example, performance evaluation and audit that focuses on your efficiency and effectiveness, but does not reward junior auditors who spend time investigating an exception, but then that exception might turn out not to be a misstatement, but it is a learning process for that junior auditor, but they're penalized in the performance evaluation. So looking at the performance evaluations to see what gets rewarded, what behaviors get enforced. Importantly, the mentoring process within the firms. I think all of the firms have done a great job mentoring, but some of the research that I've done is people will say the mentoring is not working for me because the individual who is mentoring me wants me to adopt the same path that they adopted. And for people in just this generation, they do value the meaning. What I find rewarding from doing research looking at auditors is people who are in audit really care about audit quality. They really care about the public interest in auditing. But oftentimes, the mechanics of working on audit firms where the firm has a policy, but there's disconnect between what the firm says and what the partner on the engagement wants, ends up forcing really strong, committed people out of the audit practice. And I think this is where firm culture should be taking, we should be taking a stronger look at how can we retain the people that really care about audit quality.
Thank you very much for those remarks, and I'll go over to Brian Croto.
Yeah, I agree with so much of what's been said, and it really does start at the top in terms of the leadership comms, and when you think about the organization's purpose and values, and when you say quality is your top priority, what does that really mean? And do you live and breathe that every day from the top of the organization, but throughout the organization? And look, no organization is perfect. When there's a mistake that's made or when something happens that's inconsistent, how does the organization learn from that is hugely important as well. So I think all of that, and I really commend the PCOB from an inspections perspective, the work that was done to really go deep in this area and interview a fairly large number of our partners and focus groups with our staff. We do that type of monitoring ourselves, but I think it gave the PCOB some real insight, and you saw the results of that on kind of a profession-wide basis in terms of the publication. We do quarterly surveys. We do different kinds of quarterly surveys with our people to get a pulse on whether the communications are consistently understood within our firm. And I know that's hugely important to us as we think about messages that might need adjustment, or is there a part of the organization that's not getting certain messages? Those things are important, but they're not enough. You need to also, from a day-to-day basis in your interactions with everyone within your organization, think about, is there something that's different or unusual or is inconsistent, and then deal with that appropriately and small changes that you might monitor or notice are things that sometimes need almost an outsized response. So I think it's a hugely important area. It's something that you don't change in a firm immediately or quickly sometimes, and so when there are problems, it can get difficult to adjust. And so making sure that you don't get yourself into that circumstance is the best place to be, obviously. But all the points that I think have been raised have been enormously important relative to this. And I agree with Christine. This is probably one of the most critical areas. Right from the start, relative to firms getting things right from a quality perspective.
Thank you, Brian, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jim Hunt.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, and I hope this doesn't sound trite because I mean it very seriously, a move from the firm to the profession. From the firm's perspective, you got it all right. I think from a profession, we have to move back to discussing the nobility of what we do. Years ago, Chair Williams, we had a Auditing Standard Setters International Conference in this very room, and at the very end, a gentleman from some small country, as we were lamenting people not coming into the profession any longer, he stood up there for his 5 minutes and he said, "You just don't talk about the nobility of what we do anymore." And I was so touched by that, and I walked out, and I can remember being a young CPA back in the early days, and the word bean counter and green eye shade and all this stuff. I think from the academe to those that have the podium in institutions like this, we have to begin to reinvigorate the nobility of this profession in a very, very serious and concentrated way. I hang out with a lot of MDs. They have no doubt. They're going through a lot of situations, medical doctors and medical clinical professionals right now, about burnout and things like that. But if you ask them one-on-one what it is that you do, I save the world. I save the child. This is embedded in them from the very beginning, and I think we have to re-embed that. Danny, I'll stop there because it's in the interest of time. I think it's so important.
Thank you very much, Jim. And Preeti Chaudhry?
I just wanted to add to something that James said about the whistleblower system, or maybe to add in a different perspective. I think the importance of exit interviews and seeing why are people leaving, what are the reasons, and having some independent review of that. So it's not being just done by the manager, but somebody who is sort of a little bit removed from the situation to see what's bubbling up before it becomes a whistleblower situation is another great way to investigate the firm culture and address potential problems.
Thank you, Preeti. And Board Member Bodick?
Yes, thank you. Great discussion, and agree with all the comments about how important this topic is and the nobility of the profession for sure, Jim. My question, I know we're very short time, but thinking about it in firm culture, when you think about, and this is more of a question than anything else, a major firm where multidisciplinary firm, obviously, and the audit piece, the pure public interest focus is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And thinking about the culture of the audit firm, is it the same across all lines of services, or is there differing perspectives where you get elsewhere? Someone says, well, margin commercialism is more important, or is it the same culture, or do you have to be constantly kind of fighting back and forth to ensure that the quality, the public interest focus of the firm, the brand, as some folks might call it, of the firm is the core audit? And how challenging is that to maintain, given maybe competing priorities?
Thank you very much, Board Member Bodick. Perfect. Go ahead, Christine.
From somebody who is associated with a large firm that has a multidisciplinary model, it is one culture, George, that is at our firm level, that is driven by our firm CEO over all of our functions, and that's exactly how we look at it. We have a chief ethics officer at that level that drives everything consistently throughout each function, and it's something we actually have doubled down on and focused on more as our firm has gotten larger.
Thank you, Christine. Not seeing any other tent cards right now, so I'll go ahead and hand it over to Barb for closing remarks.
Well, thank you for today's wonderful discussion and for all your contributions throughout the day. Special thank you to the Emerging Issues and Auditing Subcommittee for their work. That was a great discussion. I just want to take a moment to thank all of my PCAB colleagues who work very hard behind the scenes to make these meetings possible. This concludes our meeting, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall. Over the summer, please don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything you'd like to talk to me about, and I hope you all have a wonderful summer. And thank you to everyone who attended, and of course, those of you who joined us online. Thank you.